The tactical feed blinked a cold, unyielding red. No warning klaxons blared across the simulated streets. No panic screaming filled the comms network. There was only the terrifying, methodical silence of the human strike team below. My armor joints were rigidly locked. A localized system failure protocol had paralyzed my suit, forcing me to act as a silent observer. I watched my perfect orthodox defense, honed over 17 cycles of instruction, collapse in real time. The readout finalized at 5-0. I thought I was the apex predator here. Listen closely because I was dangerously wrong. 3 months earlier, the Axios Terminal Faculty Hall had smelled of polished brass and complacency. I sat at the head of the long obsidian table, flanked by representatives from the most powerful military species in the galaxy. The dry, rhythmic click-click of my mandibles echoed against the vaulted ceiling. It was a nervous habit I only allowed myself when profoundly irritated. The source of my irritation stood at the opposite end of the room, Commander Elias Vance of Earth. He looked entirely too small. He was lean, unornamented, lacking the heavy chitinous armor of my people or the imposing height of the Vexthar delegates. "Primitive projectile weapons," I said, leaning forward so my shadow stretched across the table. "That is what your species brings to the Academy." Vance did not flinch. His eyes, a pale and watery blue, rarely blinked. He moved with an unsettling, economical grace, shifting his weight without making a sound. "We bring adaptability," Vance replied quietly. "We survive by being unpredictable." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. The sheer arrogance of this soft-skinned newcomer offended the very core of my being. Xylian military doctrine had dominated the known sectors for 1,000 years. We built impenetrable fortresses. We crushed opposition through overwhelming, calculated force. I walked over to the cultural display case lining the eastern wall. Inside rested a freshly woven replica of the Terran constellation flag, a bureaucratic gesture of goodwill for the new arrivals. I bypassed the glass lock and pulled the synthetic fabric out. "This is what I think of Earth's traditions." I ignited my plasma lighter. The sudden heat washed over my face as the material flared bright orange. It burned beautifully, dissolving into flakes in seconds. "Worthy only of fire and forgetting," I stated. Silence choked the room. Rector Silas shifted uncomfortably in his high-backed seat. Vance simply stepped forward. He did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He knelt on the polished floor and scooped up the gray carbon ash. The gritty texture seemed to fascinate him. "Flags are just symbols," Vance murmured. "All you proved is that you needed to burn it." He looked up, meeting my gaze with absolute calm. "Your top students against my squad in a live tactical demonstration." I accepted immediately. The Obsidian Citadel simulation was a masterpiece of military engineering designed to test the limits of defensive strategy. It was a sprawling fortress of dark stone and reinforced steel perched atop a jagged, simulated plateau. For my team, I selected the finest the Collegium had to offer. Cadet Krebs, a massive Xylian with a penchant for heavy suppressive fire, anchored our frontline. Shade, a chitinite specialist who could manage 12 distinct sensor feeds simultaneously, ran our overwatch. We established our perimeter with flawless precision. Firing lanes were mathematically perfect. The northern wall backed up against a vertical drop, deemed unscalable by any known metric. "Caution will not save them," I told Krebs over the internal network. "When they come up the main ramp, we erase them from the board." 30 minutes passed, nothing happened. The holographic wind howled through the empty courtyards, carrying the faint smell of synthetic ozone. I checked the perimeter sensors for the 5th time. The readouts remained stubbornly blank. A faint unease began to curdle in my stomach. Why weren't they probing our defenses? Then a fleeting shadow darted across the southern ruins. Krebs opened fire immediately. The deafening roar of his heavy plasma repeater shattered the quiet, turning a chunk of masonry into molten slag. The shadow vanished. 10 minutes later, another movement flickered on the eastern flank. Again, overwhelming return fire from my team lit up the artificial sky. Again, the humans simply melted away into the rocks without returning a single shot. "They are running," Krebs growled, "cowards." "They lack discipline," I agreed. But my mandibles gave a singular, involuntary click. They were retreating too easily. They weren't testing the shields, they were watching our response patterns. Still, a static defense favors the patient. I forced myself to hold the line. Another hour dragged by in the simulated twilight. The inaction was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Xylian doctrine dictated that once superiority was established, one must actively crush the remnants of resistance. Sitting in the command tower while a lesser species cowered in the rocks felt like a betrayal of my bloodline. My students were growing restless. "Shade, take command of the primary battery," I ordered. "Krebs, we are going hunting." Leaving the fortress was a calculated risk. Or rather, I deeply believed it was calculated. We descended the main ramp, moving cover to cover. The terrain outside the citadel was a maze of shattered boulders and narrow ravines, casting long, deceptive shadows. I spotted two Terrans sprinting across an open gorge ahead of us. Their movements looked clumsy, panicked, and utterly exposed. Too easy. I raised my weapon, tracking the trailing human in my sights. My finger hovered over the trigger mechanism. A localized gust of wind howled through the ravine, loud enough to mask footfalls. I paused, reached up to the side of my helmet, and manually adjusted the localized gain on my audio receptors. It was a tiny, mundane adjustment. In that precise second, the trap snapped shut. The ground beneath Krebs seemed to explode. It wasn't a concealed explosive. 3 humans had buried themselves beneath the loose shale, enduring the crushing weight and lack of oxygen for hours just to position themselves. They rose like ghosts from the dust. Overlapping plasma fire, perfectly synchronized, struck Krebs squarely in the chest plate. His suit instantly glowed red, registering a fatal hit. He dropped to his knees, locked out of the simulation with a sharp hiss of venting air. I spun around, bringing my rifle to bear on the nearest attacker. A heavy impact struck my back, then my shoulder. The acrid smell of burnt wiring flooded my helmet. The red warning lights flared across my visor. System failure protocol initiated. Paralyzed in the dust, I could only access the squad's tactical feeds. I watched the disaster unfold from a dozen different angles. The humans hadn't just lured me out. They had used my aggressive push to slip past our heavily fortified outer perimeter. "Shade, report," I yelled into the comms, forgetting my microphone was permanently disabled. Through Shade's optical feed, I saw the mathematically impossible, the unscalable northern wall. The sheer vertical drop that no coalition species possessed the muscle density to climb. 2 Terrans were ascending it. They moved with terrifying high-gravity adaptation, their bare fingers finding holds in microfractures of the stone. They didn't use grapples or lev packs. They used pure, terrifying physical strength, hauling their body weight up a sheer cliff face. Shade never saw them coming. He was frantically managing the southern sensors, looking for the squad that had just eliminated me in the ravine. A Terran slipped over the parapet, moving silently behind the multi-limbed chitinite. A simulated blade drew across the primary throat sensors. Shade's feed went entirely black. The fortress was completely breached. My top students were falling one by one. I watched Daxel get outflanked in the subventilation tunnels. The humans moved like water, flowing through the path of least resistance, bypassing our heavy guns entirely. I stood frozen in the ravine, the tactical feed blinking a cold, unyielding red. No alarms blared, no sirens screamed. Just the terrifying, methodical silence of the human strike team dismantling my life's work. The score climbed on the main display, 3-0, 4-0. Vance had reached the command room. Only Cadet Rail remained, frantically trying to pivot the heavy interior turrets toward the main door. It was a textbook defense mechanism, but Vance had thrown out the book months ago. The Terran commander didn't charge the fortified doorway. He breached the ceiling. He dropped through the heavy ventilation grate directly behind Rail. The takedown took exactly 4 seconds. No, 3. It was a fluid, brutal teardown that defied everything I knew about biomechanics. Vance disarmed the cadet, neutralized the turret uplink, and registered a fatal strike on Rail's armor core in one continuous, devastating motion. The final readout flashed across my visor, 5-0, total annihilation. I did not know the terrain better than him. He knew me better than I knew myself. Caution was never their plan. They had weaponized my own aggression, turning 17 years of rigid, infallible doctrine into a lethal vulnerability. Through the main feed, Vance looked directly into the command room camera. He didn't smile or cheer. His expression held a deep, unsettling pity. The simulation officially ended. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Axios terminal arena pressed down on us. The holographic environment dissolved around me, leaving only the sterile gray walls of the training deck. I felt the physical constraints of my suit release, but my legs absolutely refused to move. I was unmoored, adrift in a reality I no longer understood. Vance walked down the main ramp from the control tower. He stopped a few feet from me. He didn't offer a mocking salute or a victorious boast. "You fight exactly like you teach," he said. "The universe only rewards those who adapt." I looked at my armored hands. They were visibly trembling. "I had never understood," I whispered. Months later, the curriculum at the Defense Collegium changed permanently. Terran asymmetric warfare became a mandatory elective for all commanding ranks. I stood in the back of the primary lecture hall, watching Vance explain the mechanics of a persistence hunt to a room of bewildered cadets. I was no longer the apex predator. She had let me burn her flag, and in doing so she had burned away my arrogance. I reached into the deep pocket of my instructor's uniform. My fingers traced the smooth glass of a sealed vial filled with carbon ash. Vance tapped the glowing tactical display, and the room of cadets leaned forward in absolute silence.